My dad started dating my late mother's sister, and even had her move into our house. She brought my cousin with her and then decided to kick me out, sending me to my grandpa's place. However, only a week after this, my dad realized the severity of his mistake when I showed up at his house with my grandpa's lawyer. This is going to be long and complicated, but I need to say it all just to get it off my chest. So much has happened to me in the last few months that I can't even tell if what I'm doing is the right thing anymore. Honestly, I've never felt so lost and alone. I'm a 17-year-old male, and I live with my father. My mother passed away less than a year ago due to a terminal illness. She had been ill with cancer for a very long time, basically in and out of the hospital since I was only a year old. The last few years were especially hard on us as a family, and because my dad was the only one working, I became my mom's primary caregiver. Sometimes her sister, my Aunt Edna, female, 38, would come over and help out when she could, but most of the time, it was just me and Mom. I gave everything I had to look after her, and I would do it all again without hesitation if I had the chance. I miss her terribly, and every day without her is hard. It feels like something vital is missing. Even though it has been months, I still find myself thinking about her every single day. I can't even go to sleep without first talking to her in my head and telling her about my day. I can't seem to let her go, even though it seems like everyone around me already has. My father is the clearest example of this. I don't know why, but it didn't take him long to move on from Mom. He took down all her pictures and stopped talking about her completely. He doesn't keep any of her things around, as if she just disappeared. I don't understand it. I always thought they loved each other deeply. From the time I was a kid, I saw how much love they had between them. Our house was full of warmth, happiness, and laughter, but once Mom got sick, that warmth seemed to slip away little by little until it was gone. By the time things were nearing the end, Dad had become snappy, short-tempered, and irritable. I feel bad for thinking this, but it almost seemed like he was just waiting for her to pass away, like he had already checked out. He stayed at work longer and longer, avoiding spending time with her. Watching him act like this was awful, but thankfully, Mom was too tired to notice that her own husband was avoiding her. I tried to fill in the gap, but I don't think I could ever have replaced what she needed from him. I thought things couldn't get worse after that, but then my dad did something no one could have imagined. He started dating Aunt Edna just a few weeks after Mom passed away. I don't think I've ever been this angry or felt more betrayed in my entire life. How could he move on so quickly? My parents were married for 20 years. How was it so easy for him to just replace her with someone else, and not just anyone, but with her own sister? It felt disgusting. When I confronted him about it, he told me that I didn't expect to understand now, but that I would when I got older. He said I just needed to respect his decision. I told him I hated him and that I would never, under any circumstances, respect his decision to date my mom's sister. I asked him how he could move on so easily after everything, and he didn't even respond. We had a massive argument, and I called him names I probably shouldn't have. His only defense was that I would understand his point of view when I got older. I told him he was a disgusting excuse for a man and that I hoped I would never turn into someone like him. I knew I hurt him by saying that, but that's what I wanted. I wanted him to feel the pain I was feeling, to feel even a fraction of the betrayal I was feeling. I thought about how much it would have crushed my mom if she knew what was going on so soon after her death. She would have been devastated. It all felt so vile, and somehow everyone was acting like I was the villain because I wasn't accepting their relationship. Even Aunt Edna tried to talk to me about it, saying I should be glad this was happening within the family so that it would be easier for me to move on and heal. I was furious. I wanted to scream at her. I told her this wasn't some breakup I needed to get over and move on from. This was my mom's death, and I wasn't ever going to move on. I told Aunt Edna that just because she had replaced Mom in my dad's life didn't mean she could replace her in mine, too. She tried to argue that she wasn't looking to replace anyone, just to start a new chapter and a new family. I told her I wasn't interested in being part of any new family. My family was my mom and dad, and if my dad wanted a new family with her at the cost of my mom's memory, then I didn't want to be a part of it. Both of them tried multiple times to convince me to come around, but I refused to budge. It got so bad that I started locking myself in my room all the time. I would only come out to eat or go to school. I shut my dad out completely, and eventually, he stopped trying to talk to me altogether. It felt like we were in a stalemate, neither of us would talk to the other, and the silence was suffocating. It was like living in a toxic environment. I could feel that my dad was just waiting for me to give in and accept what was happening, but I stayed firm. I knew he didn't need my approval for anything, but I also knew that I would never accept something like this, especially not so soon. I thought things couldn't get worse, but somehow they did. A month and a half ago, my aunt, who was now my father's girlfriend, moved into the house. Things between my dad and me were still completely unresolved, and he didn't even tell me she was moving in. I just woke up one morning to find her and all of her stuff in our house. I was completely caught off guard. I asked her what was going on, but she didn't say anything and went straight to her room. I went to my dad and asked him what was happening, and all he could say was, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" I felt like punching him in that moment, but I held back. It felt like this wicked woman wasn't satisfied with just taking my mom's place in my dad's life. She had to take over her home too. Every moment I spent in that house after that felt like I was suffocating. I had already moved most of my mom's things into my room, and that was my only comfort. I knew that if Aunt Edna got the chance, she would try to throw my mom's stuff away or discard it. So, I took what I could to protect it. She even tried asking my dad where mom's things were kept, but he told her I had them in my room. She's tried multiple times to enter my room with different excuses, but I refused to let her in. I can't stand the idea of her being in the same space as my mom's belongings. I even lock my room whenever I leave the house because I don't trust her not to mess with my stuff while I'm gone. I just want to leave this house altogether. Things took another turn 2 weeks ago when Aunt Edna's daughter, Rachel, 19, female, came home. Rachel and I used to be really close since we were about the same age, and growing up, she felt like a real sister to me. But after my mom got sick, I spent most of my time taking care of her, and Rachel and I drifted apart. We still kept in touch, but we weren't as close as we had been before. So when she moved into the house, part of me was relieved because I thought I might finally have someone to talk to. But then my dad told me that, since there wasn't enough room in the house for 4 people, I would need to stay at a friend's place for a few days until they figured something out. I was in disbelief. I asked him why, if there wasn't enough room, he allowed Rachel to move in. He said Rachel was in trouble and that, as family, it was our responsibility to help her. I reminded him that I was his family too, just like Mom had been, but he didn't seem to care. He just told me I needed to compromise and stop being difficult, or he would be forced to take action. By this point, nothing he did really shocked me anymore. He's hit such an all-time low that I now expect him to be nothing more than a disgusting person. Anyway, I wasn't worried about myself. I could have easily stayed with a few friends if I wanted to. What I was really worried about was my mom's belongings. I knew that the moment I left, Aunt Edna would take that chance to mess with her things, and I wouldn't be there to stop it. My dad doesn't care enough about me or his deceased wife to stop Aunt Edna from doing whatever she wanted. The thought of something happening to my mom's stuff made me sick with worry, so I couldn't bring myself to leave. I went straight to my room and locked myself in. A few hours later, Aunt Edna came banging on the door, asking me to come out so we could talk, but I ignored her. I refused to leave my room. I was terrified about what could happen to my mom's things, and my paranoia started to reach new heights. I was starting to lose control over my fear. The next morning, I woke up early, locked my room, and went downstairs to grab something to eat. To my complete shock, I saw that Dad had been sleeping on the couch, clearly waiting for me to come down. As soon as he heard me, he got up, and before I could do anything, he told me he wanted to talk. I told him I had no interest in talking to him. I tried to get something from the fridge and rushed back upstairs, but he blocked my way. I made several attempts to get past him, but it didn't work. He stood firm and told me, very matter-of-factly, that I had a week to move out. He said there wasn't room for me anymore and that he was choosing Rachel over me because I was, according to him, an ungrateful son who didn't appreciate anything he was doing for me. He told me he was done with me and that the only thing he might do was send me a little bit of money out of the goodness of his heart, but I had to leave the house and make room for his new family. Tears started streaming down my face. I couldn't believe the person standing in front of me was my father. I had already lost one parent, but at that moment, I realized I had lost both. My father no longer saw me as his child. I was just another person in his life, someone he didn't care about, a burden he could toss aside whenever it suited him. And the worst part was, I knew I was powerless to do anything about it. This was his house, he was the one feeding and supporting me, and he didn't owe me anything. At any moment, he could cut me off completely, and I would have no choice but to accept it. I knew he would probably use the excuse that I was almost 18 to justify his actions, but it was clear this had nothing to do with my age. It was all about him favoring Rachel over me. The hypocrisy and favoritism were glaring, but I knew there was nothing I could do. I didn't say another word to him. I went straight back to my room, closed the door, and cried harder than I had in a long time. It felt like my heart had shattered. I was being abandoned by the only living parent I had left. And even though things between us had been bad for months, it still hurt. I had started to accept that maybe I didn't mean much to him anymore, but a part of me still held on to the hope that one day, things might go back to how they were. I thought we could rebuild our relationship as father and son, that we might find some way to repair the damage. But now I knew that would never happen, and I felt like an idiot for even believing it could. He didn't care about me. He didn't care what happened to me. All that mattered to him was Aunt Edna and his new life with her. I didn't know where I would go or what I would do with all of my mom's stuff. I didn't care about my own belongings, but I couldn't bring myself to part with any of hers. They were all I had left of her, and I couldn't let them go. A few hours later, there was a knock at my door. I didn't want to answer it, but when I heard Rachel's voice, I finally listened. She said she wanted to help me and that I needed to talk to Grandpa, my mom's father, as soon as I could. She then slid a letter under the door. Honestly, I didn't know if I could trust her. Rachel seemed like a nice person, but it had been years since we had been close, and after everything that had happened, I couldn't help but be skeptical. After all, she was Aunt Edna's daughter, and I knew her loyalty was with her mother. Still, I had no other options, so I decided to take her advice. How much worse could things get? I called Grandpa, who lives in another state, and as soon as I heard his voice, I started crying again. I couldn't even get the words out at first. He kept asking me what was wrong, and eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to tell him what was happening. It took a long time to explain everything, and I also told him that it was Rachel who had urged me to contact him. Grandpa was so happy to hear from me. He said he had been trying to talk to me for months, but Dad kept telling him I didn't want to speak to him. He had even tried calling me, but he lost his phone with all his contacts, and Dad never gave him my number. Grandpa reassured me that he would handle everything and that I didn't need to worry. He said he would come to my city as soon as possible, but in the meantime, I needed to stay put. He warned me not to tell anyone about our conversation and to make sure I didn't leave the house. He also told me to keep my mom's belongings safe and locked up. He promised he'd try to be there within the week, but if anything changed, he would let me know. After the call, I felt a mix of relief and fear. I was relieved because I knew Grandpa would do something. He would either get me out of the situation or force my dad to come to his senses. It felt so good to talk to someone who actually cared about me. I've been forced to act like an adult for so long, but I just wanted the chance to feel like a kid again. I also felt terrified because Grandpa sounded so serious, which wasn't like him. He's always been a light-hearted, happy person, even after losing his daughter. I was afraid he might not be able to stand up to Aunt Edna. Everything felt so chaotic, and the only thing I could do now was wait and hope that Grandpa could fix things. Update 1. A lot has changed, and suddenly everything makes sense now. I understand why Dad has been acting the way he has. Grandpa came down last week, just like he promised, and asked me to meet him. He sent me the address of the hotel where he was staying and arranged for a car to pick me up. I packed up all of Mom's belongings and told Dad and Aunt Edna that I was leaving. Rachel wasn't home at the time, so I left without her knowing. When I arrived at the hotel, Grandpa started going through the boxes, looking for something. After a bit of searching, he found what he was after, documents, but not just any documents. They were the deed to the house we had been living in. Then Grandpa explained everything. When Rachel and I were born, he had bought each of us a house. I know it sounds over the top, but Grandpa is apparently very wealthy. Instead of setting up college funds for us, he decided to buy us houses as gifts. The house I had lived in my entire life was actually mine, but since I was a minor, my mom had been the legal guardian of the property. I had no idea about any of this, and I don't blame Mom for not telling me. She was so sick, she probably forgot. But why Dad never said anything, I don't know. Rachel's house was transferred into her name a year ago when she turned 18. That's the house Aunt Edna and Rachel had been living in. The situation with the house was more complicated than I initially realized. Since my mom passed away before I turned 18, the house was supposed to be temporarily placed under the guardianship of my father until I came of age. That was the original plan, but now Grandpa suspects that my dad and Aunt Edna are plotting together to somehow get the house transferred into their names, legally, or even steal the deed before I turn 18. This way, they could take over the house without me being able to do anything about it. Grandpa thinks this is also the reason my dad never told me about the house, and it makes sense now why they were always trying to go through my mom's belongings. It also explains why Dad has been so distant and why Aunt Edna suddenly moved in. I asked Grandpa what had happened with Rachel's house, and he told me that as soon as Rachel found out about Aunt Edna's schemes, she kicked her out. Apparently, this caused a huge falling out between them, but they had already been at odds for a couple of years. That seems strange to me since Rachel had just moved in with us, but Grandpa explained that Rachel was concerned about me. She was particularly worried because Aunt Edna had moved in with Dad, so she had been keeping in close contact with Grandpa. Together, they decided I needed to know the truth and be moved out as soon as possible. That's why Rachel had come back. No one suspected her intentions, and Aunt Edna thought she was just trying to patch things up. I asked Grandpa what we could do, considering I still had a few months before I turned 18. That's when Grandpa told me something I hadn't expected. Apparently, my mom had started to suspect Dad's intentions regarding the house when she was ill. She even had a feeling he was having an affair, though she didn't know with whom. Looking back, I'm almost certain it was Aunt Edna all along. When Mom started to suspect Dad, she contacted Grandpa and asked him to come over and help her change the guardianship of the house. That's how it stands now. Dad isn't the legal caretaker of the house. Mom had switched the guardianship from him to Grandpa in secret, and that was the document Grandpa had been searching for. Dad had no idea about it, which means all of his attempts to take control of the house were in vain because he never had any legal guardianship over it in the first place. I know I'm not using the exact legal terms, but this is how Grandpa explained it to me. Essentially, Dad no longer has any rights to the house, and Grandpa plans to act on that. He told me he's decided to move in with me and stay until I turn 18. Since he's the legal guardian, he's going to throw Dad and Aunt Edna out of the house. When Grandpa told me this, I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I couldn't believe that I suddenly had this kind of power over my own father. I didn't know what to do with it. I'm still just a kid who lost his mom, with a family that's falling apart, and I didn't want to be caught up in legal battles. I told Grandpa I would follow his lead and do whatever he thought was best. I was too exhausted from everything that had been happening, and I desperately needed some peace. Grandpa reassured me that I didn't need to worry, but all I could hope for was that things would resolve soon because I didn't have the strength to deal with any more drama or pain. I felt completely drained and broken, and all I wanted was to be free from this nightmare. Update 2. We confronted Dad and Aunt Edna, and you should have seen their faces when they saw Grandpa with me. They looked absolutely stunned. Grandpa didn't waste any time. He walked straight into the house. Dad tried to protest, but Grandpa shut him down immediately. He had also brought a lawyer with him, and I could see the fear in both Dad's and Aunt Edna's eyes. Grandpa got right to the point. He told Dad that he was the legal guardian of the property and that he planned to relocate here. He gave Dad a month's notice to leave the house. Dad exploded. He stood up and started screaming at Grandpa, insisting that he had no legal right to do this. The argument escalated quickly, with harsh words exchanged on both sides. Grandpa simply pulled out the new legal documents, the ones Mom had signed in secret, and handed them to Dad. Dad's face went pale. He claimed it was a forgery and refused to believe it was legitimate, but Grandpa calmly explained that Mom had every right to change the guardianship whenever she wanted, and she had done just that. There was nothing Dad could do but accept it. Dad was completely speechless, and so was Aunt Edna. Meanwhile, Rachel was laughing. She seemed to be enjoying the whole thing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she came over and hugged me. I hugged her back, thanking her for everything she had done. Aunt Edna, realizing what was happening, snapped. She yanked Rachel's arm and slapped her across the face, hard. Rachel now has a cut on her face, but being the tough person she is, she just grinned and said she was going to press charges. Aunt Edna crumbled, falling to the floor in tears, begging Rachel not to do it. She kept repeating that she was her daughter and couldn't believe Rachel would betray her like this. But I saw the look in Rachel's eyes. There was no going back for her. She wasn't going to let Aunt Edna off the hook. Dad, seeing how badly things were falling apart, tried to shift gears and make amends. He tried to pull me aside to talk, but Grandpa stopped him. He told Dad there was no point in talking to me now, not after he had made it clear that his loyalties were with Aunt Edna. Dad insisted that this was a matter between father and son and that Grandpa had no right to interfere. I spoke up then. I told Dad that Grandpa had every right to be involved and that I didn't want to talk to him anyway. Nothing he could say would change how I felt. All of the anger I'd been holding in came rushing out, and I said everything I'd been too afraid to say before. I told him he was a failure as a father, a failure as a husband, and ultimately a failure as a man. He had the chance to make things right, to put his family first, but he had chosen his selfish desires instead. I don't even remember everything I said because I was so overwhelmed, but I know I let him have it. When I finally stopped, there was silence. No one said anything. Rachel led me upstairs to my room, where we sat together for a long time. I was so grateful to have her and Grandpa by my side. Without them, I don't know how I would have managed. I still don't know what's going to happen next, but at least I'm not alone anymore. I have people looking out for me, and I realize now that I'm not wrong for refusing to accept the way my dad has treated me and the complete disregard he's shown for my mom's memory. Update 3. This will be my final update for everyone who's been following this. If you were hoping for a dramatic, heartwarming reconciliation between my father and me, I'm sorry, but that's not going to happen. Rachel has officially pressed charges against Aunt Edna. Aunt Edna has been trying every trick in the book to get Rachel to drop the charges, but Rachel is as stubborn as they come. Grandpa has moved into the house, and Dad has a month to move out. He's still trying to talk to me, but I've rejected every single attempt. Grandpa is keeping a close eye on things, and Dad is too afraid of him to try anything underhanded. We've recovered all of Mom's belongings, and they're safely stored in my room. Once Dad is out of the house, I plan on putting everything back where it belongs. I'll likely seal off Mom's room afterwards since I don't need such a big house for myself. A lot of people have suggested I go to therapy to process everything that's happened. I brought it up with Grandpa, and although he doesn't really believe in that kind of thing, he gave me money to get the help I need. Rachel has been coming over every day to keep me company. I regret how distant we became over the years, but I'm so thankful to have her support now. She's promised to help me find a good therapist, and she said we can always hang out whenever I need. It's not exactly a happy ending, but things are finally starting to fall into place. I doubt I'll ever speak to my father again, even if he does eventually feel remorse, which, as of now, he doesn't. The trust has been shattered beyond repair, and there's nothing he can do to fix that. Thank you very much for watching to the story so far. I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss tomorrow's stories.